Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really, fascinated by the introductory remarks that we've heard from Dr. Zakaria, and I'm very grateful to him to have set up such an international workshop to talk about an issue that is really plaguing me for many, many years, both on a personal but also political level. As someone who was born in Iran, in the city of Tabriz, in the northwest of the country, in 1981, but who then grew up as a little kid in the southwest of the country, in Ahvaz, the largest city of the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, which has a long history, of course, of colonialism and so forth, during the Iran-Iraq War, which was this most devastating war after World War II, and whose parents emigrated to Germany by the end of 1987, so we endured a lot of years there, and who then mainly grew up in the west of Germany. I myself, and I'm going to start with a kind of very short introduction when it comes to my political biography over the last 30 years. I was politicized at the age of 14 when my dad told us at the kitchen table stories of world history, and I was very struck by the savage murder of Patrice Lumumba, the post-colonial kind of leader in Congo who was savagely murdered by the Belgian royal house together with the CIA. And then I got fascinated into African politics and Pan-Ethiopianism, Pan-Africanism, and then via the Atlantic slave route, I landed in Northern America. Being fascinated by McGarveyism, black nationalism, the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And as a young teenager, I was of course very much fascinated by the alleged radicalism and the alleged non-radicalism of Martin Luther King. After years I realized this was not the case. Both of them were quite radical if you look closer at it. And what I also did not realize at the time was the issue of dogmatism when it came to the Nation of Islam inspired ideology of Malcolm X. And after his pilgrimage to Mecca, there was a huge U-turn. He dismissed the notion of the white man being the incarnation of evil, the blue-eyed devil, and realized that he could form a much larger coalition. And not so much afterward, he was killed, and probably against the backdrop that he was seen as a much more stronger kind of threat to the US establishment. I'm saying this as a starting point to point out the issue of dogmatism, and which can be a disempowering political factor instead of an empowering one. Now, today I'm going to this is a huge subject, and I hope that we can cover some of the hugely fascinating aspects that Benjamin, started laying out. As you know, I'm going to focus on the issue of Iran and of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But before doing that, there was a second stage of my political biography when I entered with this kind of political background and ideological background, when I got involved with the German and UK peace or anti-war movements. As a teenager, but later as a young student. And the turning point was that, I always believed that, the noble aspirations, which are very much enshrined in post-colonial thinking, would also be reflected in those movements. After you realize how they reacted, or a bulk of them, to the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, which was a social movement against authoritarianism, to put it very briefly, and later how they reacted to the Arab Spring uprising in 2011 in Syria, both of which they tended to depict as a Western orchestrated, CIA orchestrated, basically event, which I found hugely estranging. So this was the beginning of my end of the, of my sympathies and collaboration with them. Because I realized that they have a strong obsession with anti-Americanism as a sole form of anti-imperialism in today's world, which I could not understand at all. And they also were depriving those people, be it in Syria or in Iran, of agency, something that they would, because of ideological reasons, would normally very much appreciate. Now, the revolution in Iran of 1979, and I think the Iranian case is quite, an interesting one, came against the backdrop of the 1960s and 70s Zeitgeist that was very much, impacted by anti-colonialist and anti-imperial thinking. So this Zeitgeist, for instance, in the Iranian case, led to, some theorizations of Jalal al-Ahmad's Gharbzadegi, an Iranian writer writing about West toxification, so critique of Western ideology. So this was, probably the most important, idea in pre-revolutionary Iran, against the backdrop of the Pahlavi monarchy, that was reinstituted after the 1953 coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister at the time, who wanted to, or went on to embark on nationalizing Iranian oil. And there was a coup by the US and the UK intelligence services. But of course, what we seldomly hear about, this was also done in collaboration with domestic elements. So it was not purely an outside intervention, full stop. Be it as it may, those the zeitgeist of the era in the 1960s and 70s very much informed the 1979 revolution, also informing the kind of perception and perhaps also misperceptions that many Iranians had vis-à-vis their own leader, the Shah, who was an authoritarian leader for sure, but whom they, described as the American king, as a pure marionette of US imperialism. And what is interesting, and there are a lot of people who were engaged back then, who are now talking to also in the Iranian sphere, talking about their misconceptions, and also although the human rights record was awful during the Shah's era, there were activists, Iranian activists, who were just inventing the figures of how many people were killed. Anyway, so there is also a need to have a critical review of that era without glorifying, of course, pre-revolutionary Iran. Now, the three aspirations, the key aspirations and promises of the Iranian revolutions were also basically aspirations of post-colonialism. First, the quest for social justice. Second, the establishment of freedom and democracy. And third, independence from great power tutelage. Now, we can take a brief look at what has happened after 1979. After actually, 1979 was made possible by three major political ideological formations, as Hamid Abashi puts it, that were instrumental in, that were informing Iranian political culture. One, socialism, a kind of third world socialism. 2, nationalism, kind of third world nationalism, and 3, Islamism. But what has happened after 1979 very swiftly, because of various reasons, the revolution got Islamized through a systematic Islamization of state and society by the new rulers around the cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, the 3 aims of the Iranian Revolution, social justice, freedom and democracy, and independence from great power tutelage. First, when it comes to social justice, of course, there was uneven development under the Shah's era. There was a huge disparity in the wake of a rapid modernization between the urban and the rural population of Iran, which was a main driver for the middle class to actually, who had this sense of social injustice, to go for a revolution, although they had quite a good life back then. Now, after 46 years, after the inception of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we see that social justice doesn't look good at all. This theocracy that was established slowly but surely developed into an oligarchic system, with the bulk of the Iranian population, and the estimates vary hugely, but the bulk, so the large majority of Iranians now living in poverty, with a huge part of the middle class as well, and against the backdrop of a political elite that is also monopolizing economic power, and with a huge slum population. So on the social justice front, and I can go into more detail, but if you're interested, we can talk later on, and I can give you more figures. But in terms of social justice, things did not get better at all. Probably in comparison, they got even worse. So that the issue of social justice is a huge political issue in today's Iran, even in circles near to the regime, who very clearly see and feel that basically, for instance, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the Praetorian Guard of the Islamist regime, is headed by an oligarchy, by generals who are at the head of economic empires, whereas the rank and file of the IRGC is suffering from official inflation rates of 50%, with independent economists saying that the real figure is double that number. So there is a huge socioeconomic disparity, even within semi-state and state structures. Second, freedom and democracy. So the aspiration was that to bring about some kind of democracy, Islamic democracy, whatever, but the popular participation, basically. But between 1981 and 1985, nearly 8,000 people were executed in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and similar numbers were killed during the so-called Great Massacre in the final year of the 1980 to 88 war with Iraq. By contrast, in the 8 years preceding the revolution, that is between 1971 and 1979, fewer than 100 political prisoners were executed. So basically what the Iranians got was a much more brutal dictatorship. Of course, there were, the historical context is, of course, the war with Iraq, which Khomeini, by the way, decided to prolong after they could have a UN-mediated ceasefire by 1982. In the effort to consolidate the newly established Islamist state. So in terms of freedom of democracy, despite the numerous elections that the Islamic Republic praises itself to have, in contrast to many other neighboring states in the Middle East, they, and this is what academic research shows us, have led to authoritarian resilience rather than as a kind of venue for change, because of the institutional structure that was set up in the Islamic Republic of Iran, In textbooks you would find that those are based on two pillars. One, republicanism, with direct elections for the parliament and the president. On the other hand, you have the second pillar, which is theocracy. But the thing is that the second pillar is dominating the first pillar. The first pillar is not a republican pillar. It's at best a semi-republican pillar, because there is a pre-selection of candidates vetted by the so-called Guardian Council, which belongs to the second theocratic pillar. So in terms of freedom and democracy, things have gotten very, very bad. The Islamic Republic of Iran is for many years the #1 state when it comes to the execution rate. And of course, over the last 46 years, we've had a tremendous sociological evolution in Iran, with a society that got very much modernized and secularized over the decades, which is very much globalized and interconnected, which has very high education levels. But also, and on the other hand, you have a patriarchal system that runs the state with men above 80 who are very provincial and who very much look after one thing, which is regime interests instead of the national interest. And this is why we've seen since 2018 what I call a long-term revolutionary process in Iran, with the emergence of noble forms of protests driven by the lower classes that were hitherto considered the social base of the regime. But the regime understood, and this was a shock moment for it in 2018, that this was no longer the case, that the lower classes were not loyal entities, but they were shouting revolutionary slogans against all components of the Islamic Republic, both the military component, that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the clerical component, so which is the politically, ruling Shia clergy, but also for the first time against the two main establishments of the state, which is not only against the hardliners, but also against the reformists, who were very much celebrated in the West for many, many years as potential agents for change from above. So this is why, and the culmination of this process, this long-term revolutionary process, was the 22 Revolutionary Women Life Freedom Uprising. Now the third factor, which is independence from great power tutelage. I mean, first of all, one could see that in the latter phase, the Shah became much more pronounced against the West, if you look at, his, last interviews, which may be a factor why the West decided to dismiss him. Anyways, he was the American king, according to that Zeitgeist, and the ideology accompanying it. Now, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the revolution had one core message, which was neither Western nor Eastern, only the Islamic Republic. This was one of the main slogans. So basically, equidistance to both Cold War superpowers. But the reality was very different. After the so-called hostage crisis, it became clear that anti-Americanism was the main pillar. And not only anti-Americanism, but also anti-Israel, and the third one, the hijab, so the state control over the, the body and the lifestyle of women. In the latter years, over the last 20 years or so, the top leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran has embraced a kind of so-called look to the East. Against the backdrop of Western pressure, be it politically or economically via sanctions, to look to forge closer ties with non-Western great powers, specifically Russia and China. The result are long-term agreements that the Iranians have signed with those two, are totally intransparent. We don't know what in those long-term agreements is. And I've written about it and speculated what may be the case, but in any case, there is a strong speculation, and there is a ground for that, that those long-term agreements have engaged in a kind of sellout of national interests and resources vis-à-vis Beijing and Moscow, with the Iranian leadership hoping that those two powers could serve as a guarantee for regime survival on the diplomatic or political stage. So that, from the Iranian societal perspective, and there is a lot of evidence for that, there is huge mistrust, to say it very diplomatically, vis-à-vis those two powers. Of course, Iranians know fully well that it was not the British who were the most detrimental force in Iranian history when it comes to undermining Iranian sovereignty and so forth, and territorial integrity, but it was the Russians, by the way. So this is also nothing new, and which is an interesting factor given the kind of rapprochement between Putin and Trump these days, and the fear that this has elicited in Iran. Now, I'm going to just take a look. What time is it? 20 past, okay. This look to the East is driven very much by Iran's supreme leader, who is a kind of totalitarian leader, who has tremendous power over both state and society. And as I said, is very much mistrusted and distrusted, not only by Iranian society at large, but also part of the technocratic class. But when Iran joined BRICS, after being a member, an observing member for many years, and there were reasons why Iran was not admitted in this Russian and Chinese-driven kind of club of states. The daily of the IRGC, of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the Praetorian Guard of the regime, which is hugely involved in the repression, and who is the most important economic factor in the Islamic Republic. Javan, which means youth, titled "Hello to the New World." Of course, I'm going to not bore you about the kind of narratives that are associated also in the Iranian Islamic Republic context of how they portray BRICS. Of course, BRICS is the absolute hope for the future, to get rid of the Western-led world order, to build a non-Western-led world order based on equity, social justice, development, freedom from oppression, and so forth. So those are, narratives that you would find in other contexts as well. But even for the regime circles, the dividends from the look to the East and BRICS membership has been quite disappointing. If you look at the figures, there's hardly any economic dividends that the Iranians had hoped for. There's almost nothing in terms of Russian or Chinese investment. The Chinese kind of investments are hit-and-run investments, basically. So profit-oriented, short-term, things. So over the last months and few years, even in regime circles, there's been growing dissatisfaction with the behavior of Russia and China vis-à-vis Tehran, which is of course not surprising, because those two powers are looking after themselves rather than aligning with the kind of visions that Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, may have in terms of, the Iran narrative is interesting. It's basically Iran would be part together with Russia and China in driving the new world, which is quite megalomaniac, in a different sense that the Shah was also megalomaniac perhaps at some points, but this is the Islamist version of it, the anti-colonial version, or whatever you might call it. So there is a huge gulf between reality and rhetoric when it comes to Iran's goals when adhering to such organizations, such as BRICS, not only BRICS, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, of which also Iran was admitted, by the way, just a few years ago. Now, to conclude perhaps, I think the Iranian case serves as a precious reminder of how supposedly anti-imperial states can be the most severe force behind undermining anti-colonial and anti-imperial aspirations. From betraying those ideals all the way to engage themselves, or in the Iranian case itself, in colonial and imperial practices. In colonial practices, the kind of, also the Islamic Republic still discriminates against non-Persian marginalized ethnicities of Iran in terms of budget allocations, of course, which is much more of a continuity than a new thing. But also the kind of colonial treatment vis-a-vis, other non-Islamic religions, even non-Shia religions. But also imperial practices outside of Iranian borders. Look at the role of the Islamic Republic of Iran during the first and second waves of the Arab uprising, Arab Spring. As a counter-revolutionary force, for instance, in the case of Syria, you know that Iran was instrumental in helping the Assad regime survive its very, very difficult years by the mid-2010s. On the ground, together with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also a kind of Shia international, which the Islamic Republic assembled with some kind of Afghan and Pakistani fighters. Most of those Afghans were refugees in Iran. So cannon fodder, basically. The Islamic Republic promised them to have, a more secure status for themselves or for their families in Iran. And of course, Russia from the air. And secondly, during the second wave of the uprisings in 2018-19, we had, uprisings in countries that were not part of the first wave, including in neighboring Iraq, where there was a youth movement, a revolutionary youth movement, against the highly corrupt political post-Saddam Hussein political class that was put together, by the way, by Washington and Tehran. And Soleimani, General Soleimani, who was the IRGC's commander in charge of Iran's regional policies, who was killed by a US drone strike in early 2020 at the order of Trump. He flew to Iraq, and he headed an Iraqi governmental meeting. Imagine an Iranian guy headed an Iraqi governmental meeting, during which he said, "We in Iran know how to deal with this," probably referring to the state repression of the 2009 Green Movement, where snipers were instrumental. And what happened was that pro-Iranian Shia militias, many of them, snipers, killed hundreds of Iraqi demonstrators. Hence, also the kind of anti-Iranian sentiment that we've seen also in Shia-dominated southern Iraq, with all of the Iranian diplomatic, facilities being burnt, all of them, in the Shia strongholds, Najaf, Karbala, Basra, and so forth. So you see the disconnect between this kind of, again, the ideology and reality. And also the case of hypocrisy. Look at the Palestinian cause. The Islamic Republic being, praising itself to be the chief supporter of the Palestinians. But what basically, maybe the reality is much more complex than that. And if you look at not only Iranian policy vis-a-vis, Palestinian groups, but also other groups. It's, I mean, not over history, but over the last few years at least, it's Islamist factions, basically. And the question is whether it is really serving the Palestinian cause or is it really undermining the Palestinian cause. I think on this, there's something also to be understood because of this troubled history of post-revolutionary Iran. There is a huge gulf between state and society in Iran. So society basically opposes all the three ideological pillars of the state: anti-Americanism, anti-Israel, and the hijab issue. So probably Iran in society is the most pro-American, and I'm not saying that with, valuing, judging it, and the pro-Israeli in the entire Middle East. There is a very famous Iranian political science professor and public intellectual, Sadegh Zibakalam, who was a revolutionary himself, back in the days in 1979. But he is someone that he's, and he still says that, he is very much for the survival of the Islamic Republic. He would even take up arms, and, he's quite a, strong supporter. But he's someone who speaks truth. And a few weeks ago, he was invited to Doha, to Qatar, by the Arab Center. And I myself was working in Doha in Qatar for 2 years, so I know many of the academics there. It was interesting. He said that after the 1979 revolution, there were millions of Iranians who came to welcome Khomeini on his Air France plane to Tehran. The same happened when welcoming Yasser Arafat. So the same crowd, basically. But if today a Palestinian leader would come to Iran, there would be no crowds. And he then even said that in his estimate, the Iranian youth in particular hate Palestine. Right? And they regard Netanyahu as a hero. Yeah, and the reaction was total. I mean, the audience was, including professors, and I know all of them. It was utter. They didn't understand, and they were just, what is happening here? Their entire worldview just collapsed, And they started accusing the professor, Zibakalam, of being anti-Palestinian and pro-Netanyahu. And Sadegh Zibakalam was like, very politely actually, was like, I'm not saying that, it's not my point of view, I'm pro-Palestinian. He was describing a phenomena of Iranian society that I think beyond Iran's borders, people would not easily understand. And it's very much nurtured by the very specific historical and political experiences that Iranian society has had with the ruling Islamist regime over 46 years, And so this is why, we're talking about a tendency here, right? So we're not saying that, Iranians are anti-Palestinian, no. We're talking about a kind of reaction to state ideology, because whoever the state hates, Iranian society may opt to love him. And whoever the Islamic Republic, the oppressor, tends to love, Iranian society tends to hate, right? So it's, it has to be understood in this fashion. And for us in the West is, really, difficult to understand. For instance, another issue is the issue of Trump. And I myself was surprised. When Trump in the first term took office, whoever I spoke with in Iran and from different walks of life, all of them liked him a lot. And at the beginning, I failed to realize, and it was like, guys, he's anti-democratic, he's a racist, and so forth, And And then I understood where they were coming from, because they were regarding, Obama or Biden to be a collaborator of the regime, and Trump someone who would put pressure on the regime, their oppressor. And I would call this position, it's a position out of desperation, right? So, again, I'm talking about tendencies that are interesting to reflect upon, rather than certainties. Second, BRICS is, of course, is a largely authoritarian club. If you look at the composition, of course, there are democratic states in it, but the bulk of it are autocratic. Also, the Middle East members of BRICS, all of them, I mean, Saudi Arabia did not, perhaps yet, did not accept to go in, although they were invited, right? I mean, Egypt, UAE, Iran, and also BRICS is very much divided in itself over how to deal with the United States. There are those powers who want to seek accommodation, and those powers who want to seek confrontation. I mean, up until this week, those two states were Russia and Iran, perhaps it's now only Iran. And the Islamic Republic was trying in different BRICS summits, the last one was in Kazan in last October, to weaponize BRICS to circumvent the US dollar. After which, even Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said, no, we're not planning this. So, I mean, they're split. So as a conclusion, I think we would really need a radical moral and political consistency. If the noble aspirations connected with BRICS and anti-colonialism are to be realized. If not, the post-Western world order may even be more dangerous than the post-1945 one. Thank you.
So we're open for questions. I think Dominic there had a question. No?
Thanks, Ali. I have a general question that might be addressed to you, but maybe to all the participants. It's about something you alluded to a few times in your talk. And the question is this: now that the United States seems to be hell-bent or endeavoring to become an honorary member of BRICS, sort of the BRICS-plus, or at least it would kind of like to turn the G8 into a version of BRICS, maybe. But how will this change the way postmodern discourse is taken up in the BRICS countries now that one of the foremost representatives of the West, at least once upon a time, has switched sides?
No, just
well, thank you for that very small question. I mean, the only thing, I don't know, but the only thing I can say is that, of course, this is a huge change with Trump for obvious reasons. And this might sit well with a lot of states and non-Western powers because, the issues of values and human rights and so forth and democracy are not more on the table. So this may be sitting well with the international system as we have it, but it probably does not sit well with a lot of people's aspirations. And I believe that because of various reasons, socioeconomic and political ones, we're going to still see a lot of revolt and uprising against the status quo, especially in the Middle East, and especially in the case of Iran. Iran society has shown with all those waves of nationwide protests, that it is really cherishing those values of democracy, human rights, women's rights, and it has moved beyond the Zeitgeist of the 1960s, 70s. It has learned the lessons, historical ones, because back then, women's rights were relegated to be, just not important. Anti-imperialism was the first, struggle to go. So I think the international system as it is and as it may develop may also be at odds with a lot of state-society tensions in various corners of the globe.
Truth and then Hans, or either way.
I have a question for Ben. Shouldn't we differentiate more between post-colonial and decolonial? The way I've come to understand these terms is that post-colonial is a pretty much accurate way of getting back at the colonial period, and reading the colonial archive against the grain for historians, for example, right, and get a different perspective, a change of perspective, but without undoing whatever happened, without undoing history, basically. Whereas decoloniality goes beyond that in very difficult and very dangerous ways. That's how I've come to understand these terms, so I think they are not exactly the same. Could you say a few words about that, how you understand them?
So I would say that broadly, I'd be in agreement to say that post-colonial talked about the effects and the longer-term resonances of a colonial period in a period leading up to the present day and after colonialism. And decolonial is a kind of denialism, as if one can understand the world without access to things that actually happened. So less historicist. But I think that the difficulty with these questions is that nobody really answers to a definition. And everybody kind of runs away from trying to pin it down and define it. So again, decolonial is something that there wasn't any point at which I went with and no point at which I thought, well, this is a movement worth following. The post-colonial, at least initially when it emerged, was something which evoked a certain curiosity and a sense of analysis from many of us. It might be that chronologically, post-colonial was a term that emerged closer to a formative period in our careers than decolonial. But I, at least, don't know of anybody so enamored of the decolonial that it's an analytic worth following. That just might be my answer, and this is what makes it so tricky, because they're very slippery terms. Dhruv, and then I think Francisca had an online question. Yeah.
My question's coming slightly away from the spirit of your talk. But what was the role of people like Syed Hussein Nasser, etc.? I speak as a historian of science, who probably gave a new kind of legitimacy and a new kind of epistemic twist to the whole debates on the histories of knowledge and the Islamic sciences. Very different from those of that of people like George Saliba and others, who spoke of the Islamic sciences in a very different way. But Nasser, and I think there was this other thinker who's Shariati, could they be counted amongst the first decolonizers in this Iranian revolution? So that's my question to you. My second question is not a question, Ben, it's a comment. I'm coming from out of a meeting of BRICS in my university, a good meeting after a long, long time, given what my university has been through. And I was made aware of two genealogies of BRICS, which are antagonistic to each other, but are both part of its history. Both are probably equally right, I am told. And the first has to do with the fact that that's the official story, that BRICS is it's an economic and trade coalition of these countries. And this is the story that comes out of the IMF and the World Bank. And the important player here is somebody called O'Neill. That's the official story. Huh?
Goldman Sachs, no?
Yeah, Goldman Sachs, remember, this was the guy working for Goldman Sachs. So, yeah, Jimon, that's the one. But there's an older idea, which is the antagonistic one, which goes back to Lenin in the 1920s. And where Lenin is writing that, India, China, and Russia would make up 60% of the world's population. And, they must become the bulwark of an anti-imperial force. And this is an idea taken up in 1999 by a Russian foreign minister, Primakov, who also plays an equally important role in getting this negotiation going. I mean, it's just a comment.
In terms of the first question, more generally, whatever is associated with the, with Islamic, be it Islamic, philosophy, Islamic banking, Islamic reformism, is very much questioned, to put it mildly, in today's Iran, because of the historical experiences that and the historical legacy so far of the Islamic Republic of Iran. For instance, the most important kind of one of the most important kind of ideas was by so-called Islamic religious intellectuals of combining Islam and democracy in the 1990s, Abdul Karim Soroush, for instance. And this was very much associated with the reformist, section or faction of the establishment, and very much, dominant discourse in the latter half of the 1990s, leading also embodied by the reformist president Mohammad Khatami, who got elected in '97. But as the reformists turned out to be not part of the solution, but part of the problem, because they were not pushing for change, the reformists got very much, an enemy of Iranian society, including their intellectuals. So, and also there are also other scholarly works who look into their kind of discourse and see a lot of vacuity when it comes to how they position themselves vis-a-vis democracy and human rights. So there have been state intellectuals, basically, turned out to be such. So whatever is associated in today's Iran with Islamic is very much detested. So there's a lot of studies about the secularization, the rapid one, that also the lack of religiosity and even hatred of religion by important considerable parts of society. So that if you look at visions beyond the Islamic Republic, it's very clear that a kind of secular democracy is the key aspiration.
I wanted to briefly make a distinction between a language of legitimation and a reason. Not that I know the difference in all specific cases, but we always find a respectable genealogy for an idea that we wish to support. And I'm wondering how important Lenin could have been in retrospect in the history of BRICS. Franziska.
Yeah, we have an online question from Bipasha Bhattacharya. Pasha, it's nice to have you with us again. To Benjamin, when you say post-colonial right, what is it against? Is the left, electorally or otherwise, not a part of the effect-ridden performative acts that you speak of? To what extent is the left-right distinction, both historically and in the present moment we inhabit, not at all useful for the state of things that you describe?
I think the answer to that might actually hinge on knowing the direction and political charge of what is being said. I think it's certainly true that to be able to distinguish between the post-colonial language of a right-wing movement and the post-colonial language of a movement that still considers itself left becomes trickier and trickier. And I think that was one of the questions that engaged me when I was setting up this kind of set of questions and thinking about getting people together to discuss it. I think if left and right still mean anything in this context, it's really about the direction that that we seek to give this politics, but it's also something that that bothers me now in terms of what exactly a new right is when it seems to speak the language of democracy better than the post-left does. And I'm worried that we don't know. I don't know if that's an answer on another question. I had a set of thoughts also on what you were saying, which is so we were taught long ago, to paraphrase August Bebel a little bit, that anti-Americanism is the socialism of the fools. But anti-Americanism is something that seems to have enveloped a kind of post-left formation both outside of the West or the global North, and also in the global West and the global North. So we all tend to conflate a kind of left position as an anti-Westernist or an anti-Americanist position. And I wonder how this actually applies to an actual situation, because as you point out, it's not necessarily true that it makes any sense for Iranian civil society to hate Palestinians and to love Netanyahu. But it is a counter position which is matched as much on an anti-statist positioning as in a pro-statist positioning, that you basically take a radical counter position, and when an enemy's enemy doesn't exactly give you a friend that's worth having, then you get stuck in these circularities as well.
I mean, yes, I mean, first of all, I agree with this kind of notion that, you know, a considerable part of even the global, or at least also Western progressive circles have still this kind of obsession with anti-Americanism when it comes to issues of imperialism. And whereas in reality, you know, all those non-Western great powers also engage in their own kind of imperial policies. And this is very much entrenched in the kind of anti-war movements that we've seen in the United States, also in Germany, and who has fueled the kind of political formations that we see in this country with BSW, Bündnis Wagenknecht, a kind of, you know, nationalist, pseudo-left. And also parts of those movements who have come to, you know, regard the Assad regime and the Islamic Republic of Iran as a kind of anti-imperial forces. So this is why they, you know, they're seen, you know, not very sympathetically by much of Iranian society. When it comes to the issue of, you know, love for Netanyahu and hate for Palestinians, I'm paraphrasing Ziba Kalam here, who is talking about this tendency. So it's kind of, as you put it, you know, anti-state position. And thirdly, what I would say is that one of the most prominent slogans chanted over the last decade in Iran during all kinds of demonstrations by all kinds of groups, including school children, is that همش میگن آمریکاست دشمن ما همینجاست, which is nicely rhyming in Persian, which means that they always say it's America, but our enemy is right here at home. So those chants were even, those slogans were even chanted inside of mosques, all over the place. Yeah.
So it strikes me that the value of, let's call it the post-colonial, and let's not necessarily call it decolonial yet, although I'm still worried about how they relate to each other. The value of this rhetoric seems to exist much more outside the countries that they're supposed to apply to. I was more or less, I remember the question of whether you could trace a movement of resistance back into something that you could scripturally ground in Islam, which took place, say, in Pakistan in the 90s. That if you needed a resource to establish the rights of women, you needed to find something within the Islamic scriptural tradition. And if you couldn't, then you were stuck, but you usually could. Now, in a similar way, this was, you couldn't argue that if it weren't in scripture, then they weren't interested in it. It was simply a way to find a form of legitimation. I'm wondering how people would talk about Chinese imperialism in Africa through the rubric of a post-colonial or a decolonial imagination.
There's this idea of Islamic feminism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, which was also quite dominant in the 1990s. But there is a lot of valid criticism vis-a-vis this kind of perspective. And I also think that, debates have moved on, especially in the case of Iran. I forgot the other point, but yeah, let's move on.
Well, I don't have the answer to that. It was about Chinese empires in Africa.
The Chinese, in the case of Iran, they're seen as, a very, the coronavirus, and Iran was the epicenter of the coronavirus in the Middle East, was only made possible due to the Chinese connection. Because at the time when all the others were, ending the flights to China, the Iranian, state decided to continue flights because of the hopes associated, which I described in my talk, with China, right? So there is and then the Iranian press, the state, even the state press, went on to criticize the Chinese figures put out on coronavirus, and saying that those are jokes, the official figures. And what happened? The Chinese ambassador to Tehran intervened and at a press conference, and basically the Islamic Republic security apparatus told the press to shut up. So there's, also, I described this in my new book, which is in German, on Iran, and also, similar things have happened with Russia, the Russian ambassador in Tehran intervening in some kind of coverage by Iranian press that may be critical of the role of Russia. There is a great understanding, and I'm sure in the case of Africa it might be more pronounced, that those two powers are not in line with Iranian national interests or developmental aspirations as well.
Franziska had another one.
Yeah, we have another question from someone online, Anvesh Bhattacharya. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If not, I apologize. I see the stress on social justice in Ali's talk, on equality in Benjamin's opening speech, in trying to define post-colonialism, in a context where the concept has been weaponized by states to serve their structurally violent policies, which, as Benjamin points out, is their raison d'etre, but distinct from the idea of the nation, which they try to suppress or hide to conflate nation and state. What is the emphasis here on confronting capital and its structural exploitation of people and society through appropriation of surplus value that persists not only in the global north, funny geography in the term itself, thanks Benjamin for saying that out loud, but also in the global south, so-called socialist regimes? Or is it not being targeted, since that might lead us to true equality, justice, liberty, and fraternity of all peoples?
I mean, I think that there's a short answer to that and a long answer, which is that your unit of analysis is now cultures. So you can't really ask questions about social justice, can you? Because social justice has to happen as an act of reparation from the global north to the global south. This is not really something that is about social justice. This is about state-to-state relations, nation-to-nation relations, or whatever. So you've fixed the idea of who is relating to what. It's not actually meant to be a critique of capitalism at all. It's something that accommodates it quite usefully. There's one more, I think, question from Dhruv, and then I want to mention, by the way, that Ali mentioned his book. We have some copies downstairs if anybody's interested.
Yeah, Ben, I'm coming back to the question of past speaking to truth and about states appropriating academic movements, cognitive movements like post-colonialism and decoloniality. I mean, recently I was just reading an account of Peter Wagner of the emergence of the disciplines, the social science disciplines in the late 19th and 20th century. And over there he uses a term to designate many of the disciplines we consider disciplines as state sciences. History, legal studies, and so many others, political science. He calls these state sciences. I mean, what's new in the game?
I mean, so you're saying that the disciplines themselves are state sciences and are not expected to produce acts of resistance? Hmm? I mean, I see the point of that as well, but I don't think that any discipline, no matter how structurally inclined towards a loyalty to a state can't be used against itself. And I think that's, what we've been doing most of the time. Just as we know that there is a colonial power knowledge in the archive, but we can still use an archive for different purposes. But I can ground the point in the fact that disciplines emerged with state structures and so on and so forth. So I take that point.
I mean, in the Iranian case, there have been, after the Islamization of state and society, also an Islamization of the universities and also disciplines, right? After we had this glorious cultural revolution when universities were closed. But after that, and then there was a capitalist-driven expansion of the university system in the 1990s, so that Iranian universities were producing a lot of graduates. But it turned out to be, a factor of threat vis-a-vis the regime, because, I mean, first of all, women turned out to be hugely successful in the university system, outbidding, the male counterparts. And also with the expansion of the education, also literacy levels after the 1979 revolution. There are people and even scholars who claim that this was due to the efforts of the no-Islamist regime. I would doubt this narrative. Perhaps there were also a societal push for that. But in any case, so this expansion of the university system turned out to be a threat to the new rulers. Of course, Iranian universities were always this center of dissent, even before 1979, but in the last nationwide uprising, there were demonstrations in 150 universities all over the country, and even including this time around by school children, so in schools. Secondly, when it comes to the issue of colonialism, of course, there is also this notion, which is, in the case of the Islamic Republic itself, internally speaking, is a colonial force. So this is put forward in two respects. One, in terms of how they deal with marginalized ethnicities, but also, of course, with other religions and confessions. And secondly, this is also applied to the case of how the Islamization, or their reading of it, against women's rights, the control of the body and the lifestyle of women, and the lifestyle of society, basically. So there is a huge drive for control by the state in the Iranian case because of its peculiar ideology, that we don't see that often elsewhere, in terms of those socio-cultural and socio-political restrictions. So there is also a dimension of an internal colonization that is very much debated as well.
If we don't have an immediate further series of questions, what I would recommend is we repair downstairs for a glass of wine and a more informal chat. Thank you very much for your attention so far. Thank you, Ali.